Okay, we got a pretty small crowd, which is great. I have a ton of slides that I'm going to try to go through, but this is not for a test, so it doesn't matter, right? I can go as fast as I want to. Thanks for coming out, folks. My name is Kuilema. I teach in sociology and social work, and I am not a historian, but I've taught an interim class on Grand Rapids many times, and I know quite a bit about that history. What I'm going to try to do today is put some context around why we're here, right? In this particular place, why Calvin exists here, why people are here at all, right? And a lot of that comes back to the river. This photo was taken on August 29 of this year, so just as school was starting. And as you know, if you read the description of this session, what we were doing down at the river that day was marking, commemorating, but not celebrating, the bicentennial of the Treaty of Chicago of 1821, which was signed on August 29, 1821, so 200 years ago this fall, which took the land that we're standing on, right? So I don't know if you can see that map, but the Grand River is going through downtown there. At this time, the Grand River had islands in it. Those were later bulldozed. The river was straightened and turned into basically a glorified waste canal. But at this time, it looked like a river. And as you can see, if you look in the upper left-hand corner there, it's labeled Indian country. So at the time of the Treaty of 1821, everything on the other side of the Grand River remained Indian country for at least the next 15 years until it was also taken. You can see Reed's Lake there. We would be about there, right? Now, I want to do some theological, biblical ground clearing. I do this a lot in a lot of my presentations. I think it's important, right? Because I'm about to be very critical of the United States on several accounts, right? So this is Leviticus, and I'll just draw your attention to the red part there. The land is mine, and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. Fear your God, I am the Lord your God, right? The land belongs to God. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. We reside on God's earth as creatures made in God's image, but I would theologically reject the idea that in any true sense of the word, anyone owns the land other than God. And then from the New Testament, you cannot serve two masters, or in a more accurate translation, no one can be a slave to two lords. You cannot be a slave to both God and to mammon. Mammon used there, not money, as the idol of money, the pursuit of wealth, right? I'm going to make a case for how I understand that using an indigenous scholar in just a second. And then finally, close to home, the Fenn document, which some of you may have read. Fenn was passed in 2004, remains, I think, a really wonderful document for our community. And this is part of what it says about what we're talking about today. Now, this is not me trying to cast blame. Sometimes when I talk, people say, well, you're making me feel guilty as a white person, or you're attacking me. That's certainly not my intention. But as Fenn says, none of us can undo the fact, right? Just a fact that the United States, from its colonial origins through its founding, favored white settlers and allowed the subjugation, enslavement, and exploitation of persons of color. This legacy, as it says, this racist legacy, continues to haunt us in ways that many of us are unaware of, right? Part of what I'm trying to do today is to show you how that legacy shapes this place, and particularly our attitude towards Native peoples, right? Okay, I told you I'd use an indigenous scholar here. It's Jack Forbes. He taught at UC Davis. Founded the first Native American Studies program in the United States in the 70s. He himself is Native, or was Native. He died in 2011. He was Powhatan and Lenape If you know your Native American communities, the Powhatan were around Jamestown, right? And the Lenape were encountered by the Pilgrims. The Lenape are the indigenous people of New York City. So those were his ancestors, right? He wrote a book in 1978 and then revised it in 1992 for the 500th centennial of Columbus, right? Called Columbus and Other Cannibals. The tagline there included this word, Watiko, which is a Powhatan word. Windigo would be the Anishinaabeg word, which is the language of this place. But both of those are a cannibalistic spirit, right? So Jack Forbes, writing in 1992 on the 500th anniversary of Columbus, says that he believes the United States was started by a spirit of cannibalism. And when he says that, he means that the people who came here, who quote unquote discovered this place, did not respect the people or the land, right? And ended up, in some essence, eating that which might have supported them, destroying themselves, right? The consuming of another's life for one's own private purpose or profit is how he defines it. So, Wendigo, that's my primary framework here, and I'm going to try to sketch out how I think that happens. I'm going to do a bunch of history. I'm going to show you a bunch of different pictures of people, mostly concentrated between 1750 and 1850. And I'm going to try to make a case to you about the founding of the United States, what happens, what brings us to 1776, and then what brings us to 1821, right? So how did we get to independence as a nation? And then how did we get to Grand Rapids in 1821, right? What happened? And I think as I sketch that history, you will see that a lot of that is based on greed, right? Raw, unadulterated profiteering, accompanied by truly horrific racialized justifications. All right, everyone with me so far? Good. We're going to start way back because Grand Rapids starts way back. The first documentation that we have of people living in this area is from around the time of Christ. So the turn of the century, of the millennia, right? The year zero. These people we don't know a lot about. They are widely called the mound builders or the Hopewell culture. I could go a lot more into that. There is widespread disagreement about whether these people are direct ancestors of Native peoples, as many Native Americans claim, or whether they were a separate and distinct group, as many white people claim. Indeed, some of the colonial founders of Grand Rapids claimed that this was an ancient and superior race, and that the Native Americans had lost any of their ability to reproduce great works or art or culture, right? They called Native Americans a third race that came after these people. If you've ever looked into the history of Mormonism, there's some echoes of that sort of thinking, that there was an ancient race of good people who were destroyed by Native Americans who are an inferior race, right? I'm going to say a lot of things like that. That's not me endorsing any of that. So bear with me on that, right? So they were here starting at the turn of the time of Christ, building mounds, right? Anyone been to these? Oh, a couple people. Good. The remaining mounds are in and around Millennium Park, between the river and the highway, the Gerald R. Ford Freeway. In fact, these were almost destroyed. They wanted to put the highway right through them when they built it. The local Native community prevented that from happening. There's a couple dozen remaining mounds, but there were hundreds of mounds in and around Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids was centered on the rapids and the river, which provided food and shelter, and it was also a place of significant spiritual meaning for local indigenous communities. So people came here to bury their dead, to observe major holidays, and there were also some permanent villages here. There was a larger group of mounds downtown called the Converse Group that was bulldozed when they built Grand Rapids into the river to fill in those islands. Which is unfortunate. If you go down to Anabawan Park today, there are some, they're fake mounds. They're meant to represent the Converse mounds, but they're not actual real burial mounds. We dug these up, because of course we did, right? In the 60s, and there's people buried in them, right? They are graveyards, they're sacred sites. When we were digging them up, and when I say we, I mean white European settlers, there wasn't a lot of respect for that as a grave site at the time. There's now legislation that would prohibit what they were doing at that point. And they found significant evidence of an advanced society: pottery, tools, jewelry. It's really quite impressive. And all of this still lies underneath the mounds, down between the highway and the park. It's the oldest part of our city, and almost no one knows that it exists. Now, how did we get here, right? How did Europeans get here? Again, I'm going to be coming from that framework because that's who I am. Part of that's Christianity, right? You may have heard of this. If you've taken a class with me, you definitely have heard of this. The popes issued a bunch of decrees known as bulls, papal bulls, declaring that anywhere there weren't Christian Europeans was empty, terra nullius, right? And you could take it, and you could sell it, and you could enslave it, and you could take that money and do what Christians were most fascinated with doing at the time in 1095, which was crusades. They wanted to take land and take people in order to fund holy apocalyptic wars to take Jerusalem, right? So the first of these was in 1095 by Pope Urban, who also launched the first crusade, right? So there's always been a tie between conquest, colonialism, Christianity, and an apocalyptic end-of-the-world eschatology, right? We'll skip ahead to the discovery, in quotes there, because newer scholarship, in fact, just last month, has suggested that indigenous people have been in the United States for as long as 23,000 years. Up until this point, we thought it was 13,000 years. Major discovery out of White Sands, New Mexico, just last month that through radioisotopes said, no, it's probably more like 23,000 years that people have been there, which would have meant they crossed over the glaciers, which people didn't think they could do, right? They pinged 13,000 because they imagined they had to wait for the glaciers to retreat before they could come. Now, you've heard of this again, another papal bull, this one 1452. So these are rolling out over a 500-year period. This one, again, saying to the Christian kings of Europe, go and subdue Muslims and pagans wherever you find them. You can make them your slaves. You can take their kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, and dominions, and you can convert all of that to your profit, right? Take it, use it, let's go get Jerusalem. This is, in fact, what animates Columbus. In parts of the United States that still observe it, Columbus Day is when? It's Monday, also known in many other places now as Indigenous Peoples Day, including Grand Rapids. But Columbus, little known fact, was very much motivated by the desire to retake Jerusalem. He writes a letter in 1493 to Ferdinand and Isabella saying, if you let me exploit these islands for another 7 years, I can get you 50,000 cavalry to retake Jerusalem. He's obsessed with it, right? He's obsessed with getting gold to take Jerusalem and doing whatever it takes to do that. He's also a deeply Christian man. He did devotions every day on the boat, celebrated communion. This was because of his Christianity, not in spite of it. All right, we're moving fast because we got to get towards Michigan here. You've heard of Jamestown, right? 1600s. First folks get here. The Powhatans, I remember, or mentioned, Jack Forbes, his people, were in this area. You get Pocahontas, which is not the story Disney told you. Doesn't even marry John Smith, marries a guy named John Rolfe, who's significantly older. Pocahontas becomes Rebecca, which is maybe not as interesting to be a Becky. And Becky, unfortunately, dies in 1617 in England, where she had been taken, probably from an illness that she caught there. Her son that she had with John Rolfe is never really mentioned again. He comes back with his dad and fades into obscurity. The other reason you've heard of this, and this isn't the focus of this presentation, but would be 1619, right? This is also where the first enslaved Africans came. stolen by English pirates from a Spanish ship, the San Juan Bautista, right? St. John the Baptist, which was taking them from Angola to Veracruz. They sold them for food, right? To the people of Jamestown, first enslaved Africans in the English-speaking parts. There were enslaved Africans in Florida in the 1500s. We won't talk more about that, but it does shape all of history here, right? What I want to talk lots about is land, right? So if we say that the United States is founded on slavery and genocide, on stolen labor and stolen land, there's a lot of attention, and including from myself, on slavery and its role in the founding. Nicole Hannah-Jones, who put together the 1619 Project, I don't think is wrong that slavery was one of the factors that motivated independence. But I'm going to make a case here to you that land was a big one. The desire for land that they did not have a right to. The first European to get anywhere near where we are today was Etienne Brulé in 1621. You can see the Great Lakes are looking pretty misshapen there, but he went up the St. Lawrence and was later killed by some native peoples. For a long time, Michigan is French. From 1621 until 1762, it's all France, right? New Canada. This all changes later, but Europeans at this time are only living at Michilimackinac, right at the tip of Michigan, and at Detroit, Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit, which was, there's my French accent, which was founded in 1701, right? No one was anywhere in West Michigan. No one was anywhere around here. And even then, you're talking a couple hundred Europeans. So what happens? Land speculation is what happens. Now, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some companies out of Virginia. The Loyal Company of Virginia and the Ohio Company of Virginia. Virginia, you may know, was the big colony in colonial times. It was the powerhouse. And they wanted to be even bigger, so they wanted to speculate in land in the Ohio River Valley. The land in the Ohio River Valley was lush and good farmland, and they wanted it. You may notice, if you look very closely, that one of the explorers here is a guy named Peter Jefferson, who happens to be Thomas Jefferson's father. Thomas Jefferson follows his father into the business of land surveying. I'm going to make a comment that many of the founding fathers, I think not coincidentally, started their careers as land surveyors on the frontier. They went out, they mapped the land, and then they thought, what would it be like if I owned all that, right? A pretty simple, straightforward train of thought for them. All right, now, I said it was French for a long time until it wasn't, right? The French and the British fight over this in the terribly named French and Indian War, because it's really a war between the British and the French with native people on both sides. Native people trying to survive by allying themselves with colonial powers that they thought would treat them better, right? So this rages for a while. I'm not going to get too into it, but the long and short of it is that the French lose, and they have a big debate about whether they're going to keep Canada or they're going to keep an island called Guadeloupe in the Caribbean. And the French actually prioritize Guadeloupe over all of Canada because they can grow sugar there. And at this time, colonialism is mostly interested in slavery and sugar plantations. So the British get Canada, and with it, New Canada, which was Michigan, right? All through this time, the people fighting are very clear that they think that native people are subhuman and ought to be killed by any means necessary. This is probably the most famous quote about this, but this is Jeffrey Amherst, who was fighting for the British, who would later become the Americans, saying this is the vilest race of beings to ever infest the earth, and actually deliberately engaging in biological warfare, right? You've heard stories about blankets infected with smallpox. Those are not just stories, that's documented historical fact. They deliberately infected native people with smallpox in order to kill them. At the end of the war, King George, who you know from the Declaration of Independence, draws a line through the Appalachian Mountains. It's called the Proclamation of 1763. He says, all this business of fighting over New Canada, over Michigan, is costing us too much. You can't go over there. That's going to be native land, right? So King George says to the 13 colonies, you have to stay on the seaside of that line, right? You can see the line. Michigan is over the line. Now, the thing is, they already owned land on the other side of that line. So they don't like this. They hate this. And I would submit to you that this is definitely one of the drivers of the Declaration of Independence. And I'll make that case even more specifically in a little bit. So the king says, we're not going to do that. He also raises taxes because they went into a bunch of debt fighting wars, as nations are wont to do. And he puts that debt on the people in North America, which they also don't like. You've probably heard about the debt and the taxes on tea and stamps. We don't talk as much about the fact that the Founding Fathers owned land on the other side of that line that they meant to have. Also at the end, you get some indigenous resistance. I'm going to talk about this a couple times, but when I was growing up, we sort of talked about this as expansion into an empty country, right? That was more or less never pushed back on, right? Everyone seemed fine with it. The opposite is the case. At several junctures, Native people try as hard as they can to stop this. The first major one of these is Pontiac, not just a car. Chief Pontiac was an Odawa chief. He was from in and around this community. And when he went to war in 1763, he had spent the previous summer in Grand Rapids in 1762 recruiting soldiers for this fight. Pontiac put together one of the first large-scale pan-Indian confederacies, right? Up until this point, the U.S. government had been working single tribe by single tribe, and Pontiac went around and said, look, we're getting killed this way, right? We have to come together to stop this. So he puts together a confederacy and goes to war with the United States. And does quite well, actually. All those little fire logos are forts that Pontiac and his troops took during Pontiac's war, including in the most spectacular fashion, Fort Michilimackinac, where they had some people play a fake game of lacrosse outside the fort and throw the ball into the fort and then ask for them to open the gates to get the ball back, and then they killed everyone in the fort. So Pontiac, pretty down with the tactics. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but let's just to say people fought back against us and fought back hard. You may notice that Pontiac is all the way into Pennsylvania and Virginia here, right? This also raised big eyebrows in Washington, D.C. They did not like Pontiac. There's a quote from him about this, right? It's important for us, my brothers, that we exterminate from our lands this nation which seeks to destroy us. So Pontiac, we'll talk about some other folks in a bit. One of the subsequent actions the next year, so that's 1763, right? Proclamation line comes out, Pontiac rebels because he doesn't want to be under British control. He felt much more comfortable with the French, who were largely leaving him alone, right? So that's all part of the same deal, right? We switch from French to British control. Pontiac tries to get independence at that moment. He's put down. And then the United States starts paying people to scalp Indians. So you probably can't read this too clearly, but this is from the governor of Pennsylvania offering 150 Spanish dollars or pieces of 8 for the scalp of any Native American man, right? Pennsylvania, not the only place to do this. We often associate scalping with Native people, and that's certainly the propaganda that colonial media put out there. But we, as a government, were actually paying people bounties, more than you could earn in a year for the scalp of a Native American. If you look closely at this, this is also for the scalp of anyone over the age of 10, right? So you bring in the scalp of an 11-year-old, you get 150. All right, so the line. We don't like the line. Who doesn't like the line? George Washington doesn't like the line. That's a younger George Washington, not the usual pictures you see of him, but he fought in that war, right, with Pontiac and with other people, and in the French and Indian War for the British, right? At this time, he was a lieutenant colonel. Washington, as part of recruiting militia in Virginia, promises them 200,000 acres in the Ohio River Valley. He says, hey, if you come with me to fight Native people, I'll give you free land, right? So he's counting on having land on the other side of that line to pay back his soldiers, right? He also has selected the best land among it for himself. In 1773, he bought personally 20,000 acres on the Ohio River. When he died in 1800, he had 52,194 acres in Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, New York, Kentucky, and Ohio. 81 square miles. If you look at just what that was worth in raw dollars at the time, it's about 780,000. Not so impressive. If you do inflation, it's about 15 million. Still not that impressive. I think the equation that I've seen that captures this the best is to look at his personal wealth compared to the entire GDP of the United States at the time, which is to say, what slice of the entire economy of the United States was George Washington's? Does that make sense? And if you do that calculation, he had about $26 billion. So Washington was a land billionaire by any, I think, modern reasonable calculation. He stood to benefit from this tremendously. And again, he started his career as a land surveyor. Now, you may think I'm making that all up, right? So here's some quotes from George Washington. In a letter he wrote, again, look at the date here. This is 4 years after the line has been drawn. And he says, I can never look on the proclamation, the line, in any other light, but I say this between ourselves, than as a temporary expedient to quiet the minds of the Indians. It must fall, right? And he says, we're going to secure some lands. If you help me do this, you will come in for a handsome quantity, right? My plan is to secure a good deal of land. Now, one way to measure Washington is to take him at his public words. Another way is to read his private letters to people. I happen to think these are probably more revelatory of his character. He goes on to say, keep the whole matter a secret. We don't want to alarm the king. We can do this all by silent management, and you can do it for me by pretending to be going hunting, right? Leave the rest to me and to time. So there's George Washington making his plans to enrich himself with land in the Ohio River Valley, in I think fairly unambiguous terms. He says, look, this is just part of running a nation. I have to promise land to people to get them to fight for me. What inducements have men to explore uninhabited wilds? Not uninhabited, right? But the prospect of getting good land. You're not going to risk your fortune if you don't believe you're coming in for a profit, right? Now, again, we pitch the Revolutionary War as fought for principles of equality and democratic government. It was also fought for greed, right? Greed for land. All right, Georgie. Okay. At the same time, we're increasing our brutality towards Native people. There's some pretty disturbing details here that I'm going to share, so there's a trigger warning, right? Again, this is all before the United States declares independence, but this is all happening in land that is technically off limits to us. This is all happening in the Ohio River Valley. And if you don't remember your geography, the Ohio is important because it's the major tributary into the Mississippi. It sort of cuts off the entire Midwest. Between the Mississippi and the Ohio, you have Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana. We'll come back to the maps. This will become apparent. People move in here. People looking for cheap land, right? Or free land, and they kill the native people there. They do this in large part by getting them drunk, right? And then killing them for profit, and then claiming that they had been attacked. So the Yellow Creek Massacre, April 30, 1774, a group of men from Pennsylvania, led by a guy named Jacob Greathouse, went to a community of peaceful Mingo Indians and ambushed them after promising them liquor and games, right? Massacred everyone, men, women, and children, and mutilated the bodies. In a particularly brutal detail, Jacob Greathouse ripped open the womb of a woman and scalped her unborn son. So these are not good people, right? Afterwards, one of those who refused to massacre the Indians said, "They told us that there would get a great deal of plunder, further that the Indians would be made drunk by Baker, and that little danger would follow the expedition." So this was premeditated murder enabled by whiskey, right, against men, women, and children. Now, Chief Logan, the guy who was on the previous slide, did not take kindly to his sister being mutilated and his nephew being pulled from the womb and scalped. He fought back, and they used that as a pretext to invade the Ohio River Valley, right? So this was not a war started by Native people. I would say this was definitely started by terrorists. And then when they fought back to defend themselves, the colony of Virginia organized a 2,000-man militia and invaded the Ohio River Valley. Again, this is not part of the United States, and we've been explicitly told by King George to stay out of it, right? And here we are marching an army in. Lord Dunmore, who was the governor of Virginia at the time, said that his war was, this is him describing his own war, right? Undoubtedly attended with circumstances of shocking inhumanity, but that it was worth it because the victory may be means of producing happy effects by impressing an idea of the power of the white people upon the minds of the Indians. Now, we're almost to independence, and I hope I'm sketching a pretty clear case that this was about land. One more piece of legislation makes, I think, this pretty crystal clear. In 1774, the British government declares that all that land north of the Ohio and east of the Mississippi, all the green stuff, is actually going to be part of Quebec, right? So they had said, stay behind the line, 1763. Now they say, actually, this is not going to be part of the United States or whatever you're doing down there. It's not even the United States yet. This is going to be Quebec. Now, again, this presents a real financial threat to Washington, Jefferson, Ben Franklin, all the founding fathers who own land in that green area, right? They have the deeds to it. So they don't really like that. And I don't think there's a lot of coincidence between that happening in 1774 and independence in 1776. There are certainly other reasons. I am not saying that is the only reason. It's a very complex thing. But it's hard to ignore the fact that they stood to achieve vast personal fortunes by maintaining that land. Also, a quick reminder that all of those guys owned slaves, right? So these people are motivated, again, by the theft of land and by stolen labor and enriched by the two. When we declare independence, we flip this script and say it is the Indians who are attacking us, and that's why we need independence. We don't mention that 2 years before this, we sent an army into the Ohio River Valley to attack them, right? Instead, we say, as Justification 27, the final justification of the Declaration of Independence, right? We have a whole list of grievances with King George. And the last one is this one. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us. That means slave rebellions. They were very afraid that the British would get their slaves to rebel against them and kill them, as was happening in other parts of the world, like Haiti. And endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Now, that doesn't really square with the Yellow Creek Massacre or with Dunmore or with any of the previous history I've given you, right? Sure, there were acts of inhumanity by native warriors against frontiers people, but they were largely provoked by those frontiers people, right? And certainly the most egregious examples were often the other way around, right? This narrative, though, the narrative that we had to defend ourselves from the natives, right? Not that the natives needed to defend themselves from us and our westward expansion, but we had to defend ourselves from them, was sold by all the politicians, including Ben Franklin, who, as I said in my class, was a progenitor of fake news. He put out the thing on the right there, which he called a supplement to the Boston Independent Chronicle. Here's the thing, that doesn't exist. He made this up. And what he said this was an interception of a letter from Seneca warlords to the British bragging about how many colonists they were killing, right? So he said, we happened to intercept, is sort of the emails type thing, right? We happened to intercept this communication that was going to the British from these Native Americans who are bragging about how many people they've killed. And he said that the letter was accompanied by bags and bags of colonial scalps. Now, none of that was true. But he went into great detail, right? You know, in bag number 8, there were this many scalps of clergy people. In bag number 9, there were this many scalps of girls, right? Again, totally making up all of this. Why is he doing this, right? He's doing this in 1782 because the war is not going well. We declare independence in 1776, but we don't get it until 1783. Right? I don't know how clear that timeline is for everybody. So we're still fighting, and people are beginning to be like, maybe we're better off with the British. And Franklin and other people are very interested in a narrative that says, no, we're not. Look, the British are collaborating with Native people to kill us, right? This feeds independence fervor among people. But it's always been this sort of racialized thing. Now, who was actually killing people at the time? This is another probably the most gruesome thing I've ever read about, other than lynchings in the southern United States, 100 years later. But in 1782, at Gnadenhutten in Pennsylvania, a group of men who were looking to exact vengeance. They thought some Native people had killed some people they knew. They couldn't find those Native people, so they settled on killing any Native people, right? So they went to a village of Christian Native people. They were Moravians. They were pacifists. They got there at night. They said, we're going to kill all of you. The Moravian natives said, can we at least spend the night in worship? So they did. They sang hymns and prayed all night while the white folks got drunk. And in the morning, they systematically raped all the women and girls and killed every single one of them. Scalped them, mutilated their bodies. Not really, that's giving you like the not as troubling details. All right, then we win the war, right? The Treaty of Paris, signed in the name of the most holy and unchanging Trinity, John Adams and Ben Franklin. So we end the war, but we have designs on what was New Quebec from the very beginning. This is a map produced by Thomas Jefferson, who was, again, a land surveyor. Jefferson, if he had had his way, would have named this region these names, which are a mashup of like pseudo-Greco-Roman names and fake Native American names. So Jefferson wanted to create 10 states out of this area. Now, this is 1784. We've won the war, but we don't even have a constitution yet. And I think that's an important detail. Even before we sign the Constitution, we're already saying we're going to take this land. 1821, where we actually take the land, is a long way off. But even as we're putting the country together, we obviously intend to take it, right? This was always part of the plan. 1787, again, right at the same time as the Constitution. So the Constitution is ratified in September 1787. The Northwest Territorial Ordinance is signed in July, right? And in fact, it was part of the negotiations to get to the Constitution was we're going to take that land, right? And here's how we're going to divide it up, right? Now, they talk a big game in here, right? The utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. They shall never be invaded or disturbed unless in a lawful war, right? Okay, there's your big exception, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to preserve peace and friendship. That's all a lie. They knew what they were doing. They intended to take the land. There's no doubt about this. So there's the U.S. when we signed the Constitution, 1787, and you can see the Ohio River and everything north of it, right? There's almost no one here, right, when the United States begins in terms of European settlers. We signed the Constitution, we the people, and wouldn't you know it, the native people are like, no thank you, not really interested in this. We would like you out of here. This is the second great attempt to push back the United States. So you had Pontiac's War after the French and Indian War, and then you have what's variously called Little Turtle's War or the War of the Western Confederacy. Again, Native people come together and say, we have to work together. And it's actually a spiritual revival movement. They say, stop wearing Western clothes, don't drink alcohol, return to the ancient ways. Band together. We have to fight this. So Little Turtle and Blue Jacket of the Shawnees and Little Turtle of the Miamis bring together a huge, again, group of Native people and fight against the United States. They actually achieve, I don't have a slide on this, but the single most devastating defeat of the United States that has ever taken place. It's called St. Clair's defeat. George Washington sends a general named St. Clair to attack Little Turtle and Blue Jacket, and he engages them in a battle, and they kill 97% of the colonial army. Over 1,000 people go in, 24 Europeans come out. This is actually the first congressional inquiry. So, if you think about like a Benghazi commission, the first one is what happened out here? How did this group of the Western Confederacy defeat a U.S. Army? So we rebrand the entire army and call it, in what I think is just a really interesting maneuver, the Legion of the United States. We're obsessed with Rome, right? Who is, by the way, again, not the good guy in the Bible, but, So we renamed the Legion of the United States. We put it under control of Anthony Mad Wayne. His nickname was Mad. And he goes out and defeats Blue Jacket and Little Turtle and takes the Miami capital of Kekianga, which was a community of several thousand people, demolishes it, and builds someplace that you probably know today as Fort Wayne, right? Indiana. Used to be the ancestral home of the Miami. And it's a deliberate power statement to raise your capital and build a fort on it. Michigan, for a while, was entirely known as Wayne County of the Northwest Territory. So Wayne County, Detroit, comes from the fact that for a while, it was all named after this guy. Quick side note here. This is something I always point out when I talk about the United States and colonialism. This is all happening in the context of the development of racial science, right? European intellectuals are developing ideas about scientific race and racism that parallel the creation of the United States, and I think you always have to look at the creation of the United States within the context of those ideas, right? Because these ideas are used to justify what we're doing, right? So in Carl Linnaeus, animal, vegetable, mineral, kingdom, phyla, class, all that stuff, that's all Carl Linnaeus, right? But Linnaeus also in the top corner there divides humanity into the white European, the red American, the yellow Asian, and the black African. So, Jesus loves the little children, red and yellow, black and white. That is Carl Linnaeus, right? Who divides people into racial groups. That's 1735. The United States is coming together. That gets further amplified by Blumenbach in 1795, who classifies white, yellow, brown, he adds brown, the Malayan, black, and red. So some people, even people writing in Kent County in 1880s, are saying the natives are probably racial descendants of Mongolians, right? They're a yellow people. And some people are saying, no, they are totally unique to North America and maybe not even related to other people at all. They may have descended from a totally unique indigenous population of creatures, right? So this is the scientific debate about the racial identity of Native people. All right, 1800s. You guys are doing great. Hopefully this is at least somewhat interesting. We're going to zero in on some people in Grand Rapids. So Indiana, right? Anyone from Indiana? Yeah, so Indiana is called Indiana because it was supposed to be a perpetual home for Indians. Anthony Wayne said, hey, I'm going to take Kekianga, but the land over there is Indiana. That's Indian land. You can keep it forever. Now, that lasted about 20 years. Forever tends to be about 15 to 20 years when the United States says it for the next 100 years. But as you can see right there, the whole territory is called Indiana. It was going to be an Indian territory. We get into another fight with the British. They burn down the White House. That's pretty humiliating. And you get the person that most people would say is the most famous Native American. Anyone heard of Tecumseh? A couple people. More people, and this is a sad state of affairs, have heard of William Tecumseh Sherman, who is named after Tecumseh, than Tecumseh. But Tecumseh was from the Panther clan of the Shawnee. His name means shooting star. And he fought in Little Turtle's War, and then again in the War of 1812. You can see Native people seizing moments of possibility for their independence, right? So after the French and Indian War, right? After the creation of the United States, during the War of 1812, they're saying, is this a window where we can finally secure a future for our people? And Tecumseh steps into that in the War of 1812 and just before with his brother, who goes by, you can see sort of the eclectic look, is known as the Prophet. And he, again, is this religious revivalist who says, let's go back to the ancient ways. The white people are here to destroy us. We have to purge ourselves of anything to do with them. Tecumseh and his brother start a village in Indiana that's called Prophetstown, and it draws between 6,000 and 10,000 people, making it by far the largest settlement of people anywhere in this entire region, right? So it's this massive settlement, and of course the United States attacks it. Led by a guy named William Henry Harrison, who goes on to be president, and he is elected virtually entirely on this accomplishment. If you've ever heard the phrase Tippecanoe and Tyler too, it's an ancient political slogan. That refers to the Battle of Tippecanoe, where William Henry Harrison attacked Prophetstown when he knew Tecumseh was gone, which is a pretty cowardly move on my part. So he attacks, Prophetstown is defeated and burned to the ground. But Tecumseh survives and goes on to fight with his British allies against the United States, again to try to achieve independence. He's ultimately killed on October 5, 1813 at the Battle of Thames near Lake Erie. And the man who supposedly kills him goes on to be vice president of the United States on the strength of his having killed Tecumseh. It's a really sort of tragic tale. Tecumseh issues, let me see if I can find the exact quote. On October, right before he's killed, he sends a messenger to William Henry Harrison, who he's fighting again. He says, I have with me 800 braves. You have an equal number in your hiding place. Come out with them and give me battle. You talked like a brave when we met at Vincennes, and I respected you, but now you hide behind logs in the earth like a groundhog. Give me your answer. So Tecumseh wanted to fight Harrison on equal terms. Harrison wasn't interested in that. Tecumseh and his British allies are killed by an American force that outnumbers them 3-1 in October. And his body is, of course, scalped and mutilated. People take pieces of his skin as souvenirs. Now to get to Grand Rapids, the connection here is that the local Odawa chief, Noaquagashek, or Chief Noonday, was at that battle and received Tecumseh's hatchet and hat, right? So he carries on the legacy of Tecumseh into the future. There's a statue of him, this statue, on Grand Valley's campus. One of the things I'm trying to encourage with this presentation and focusing on the bicentennial is that Calvin can do a little more to acknowledge the indigenous history of our community, right? Quick legal side note, and then I'm going to blaze through to Grand Rapids and we'll end with some music. One of the whole things going on here is that even as we're stealing the land, we're making complicated political and legal cases that Indians never really owned it, right? And so it's fine. We always justify colonialism. So Johnson v. McIntosh is a court case where a group of Indians sells some land to a man, and then they sell it to the US government, and then the US government sells it to somebody else. The court decision case is who owns it? The person who bought it directly from the tribe or the person who bought it from the US government? Does that make sense? And the Supreme Court says it's the person who bought it from the US government because tribes can't own land. They can only occupy land. This is still legal precedent today in the United States. All right, Michigan, Lewis Cass. So there's a Cass Street right by my house, Cass County, Cass Tech School, all these named after Lewis Cass. Lewis Cass was not a very good person. I always tell people he was as he looks, like a mean guy. Yeah, so he is the first governor of Michigan, right? The first governor of the Michigan Territory. He's a general who fought in 1812, no surprises there, and is sort of given this spot because of his military service. Lewis Cass later runs for president. I always like to show this cartoon because he has a bleeding sword over his head labeled Manifest Destiny. Lewis Cass was a US imperialist. He wanted to take all of the Western Hemisphere for the United States. The little speech bubble there, he's saying New Mexico, California, Chihuahua, Zacatecas, Mexico, Peru, Yucatan, Cuba, right? So this is an argument that Lewis Cass wanted to basically take the New World for the United States. And he wasn't the only person to believe that when he ran for president. Just look at the red parts here, right? This is from a speech he gave in 1830, in which he makes that case that I just made to you, that Native people don't own this, and so it's fine to take it, and that indeed God intends this. So he says the Creator intended the earth should be reclaimed, right? And we don't want to leave the land in a state of perpetual unproductiveness. We have to make the land productive. When we came here, when our forefathers came here, they found it in a state of nature, traverse but not occupied by wandering hordes of barbarians, right? So this is Lewis Cass saying, look, they were just kind of on the land. They weren't really doing anything. It's fine to displace them. So he does that, right? And again, we talk about these treaties now, but remember, the US government had laid this out back before the Constitution was signed, the Northwest Territory, right? So now they're just getting to it. And they basically force these treaties down these communities' throats at the barrel of a gun and a bottle of whiskey, right? Their standard operating procedure is to roll into town with troops and huge amounts of booze, get everybody drunk, sign the treaty while the troops are sitting over there and call it good and happy, right? They do this all over the Midwest. This is from the treaty that I just showed you, Treaty of Saginaw. And again, this is written by somebody who was a colonizer. You can only imagine what this might have looked like had it been written by a native person accounting these meetings, right? It's a shocking amount of transparency about what they're doing, right? He says, the first Indian who spoke in reply to General Cass in a violent and angry manner against ceding the lands, right? So here they are to negotiate the treaty. The first and most important guy to get up speaks violently and passionately and says, we should disband the entire meeting. I have no intention of doing this. But he says, fortunately, he was too drunk to really be effective. And he says, not so fortunately, the next guy said the same thing, and so did everybody else, right? So Cass retired in a state of disappointment and anxiety, right? General Cass is worried he may not get his treaty. But fortunately, the central chief remained intoxicated for the duration of the negotiations, and they were able to sign the treaty, right? This is how we got the land, right? We got the land by getting people drunk, threatening them with guns. We had always intended to take it, and we weren't going to be stopped by anyone. His signature is on it, right? Even though he is recorded as violently opposing it. After the payments are finished, Cass orders more booze, dump it on them, and wait until they sleep it off, right? This is just a shocking amount of sort of drug dealing, encouraged substance abuse, a violation of consent, right? There's no real consent here. This borders on language of rape, right, in terms of the process. Same thing happens with the Treaty of Chicago. Lewis Cass again goes, and again people are like, we don't want to do this. So much so that Noonday, who I mentioned, who had gotten Tecumseh stuff, was very much the leader of West Michigan. He's not even at this conference, right? He says, I'm not going. I have no intention of selling the lands. So Cass negotiates it with people he knows don't even really have the authority to negotiate what they're negotiating. And even then, the people who show up say, we don't want this, unequivocally. And this is recorded in our own documents, right? So Mattia, and this is where I got the headline for the talk, right? Mattia says, a long time has passed since we first came upon our lands, and our old people have sunk into their graves. They had sense. We are all young and foolish, and we do not wish to do anything they would not approve were they living. We are fearful we shall offend their spirits if we sell our lands, and we are fearful we shall offend you if we do not sell them. This has caused great perplexity of thought because we have counseled among ourselves and do not know how we can part with the land. Our country was given to us by the Great Spirit, who gave it to us to hunt upon, to make our cornfields upon, to live upon, and to make our beds upon when we die. And he would never forgive us should we bargain it away. Right? So this is the literal recorded speech of the guy Cass is negotiating with. This doesn't sound like a yes to me, right? This does not sound like a yes to me. And in fact, he's framing it very much as, this is the land God put aside for us, right? And there's a theological question at play here. About who the Great Spirit is, about what God really thinks about manifest destiny. Certainly the settler colonialists said God wanted them to have the land, and here Matthias says the Great Spirit wants us to maintain the land. You have to think about what you believe about that. Here's the cannibalism, the greed part of it, right? This is from the same speech by Mattia. When you first spoke to us for lands at St. Mary's, we said we had a little and agreed to sell you a piece of it, but we told you we could spare no more. Now you ask us again. You are never satisfied. We have sold you a great tract of land already, but it is not enough. We sold it to you for the benefit of your children. We have but a little left. We shall want it all for ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. What lands you have, you may retain forever, but we shall sell no more. Now, he did, right? At least according to the government. He sold them the land for $5,000 and a blacksmith and a school that were built at what's now the site of the Grand Gerald R. Ford Museum. All right, so let me just give you then a couple of perspectives from some of the actual colonizers, including the original missionaries, and we'll wind down. You guys have been great. I'm impressed. Isaac Mccoy was probably the first white man to settle in Grand Rapids. He was a Baptist missionary. He was at the Treaty of Chicago and again recounts the same thing. It was all about barrels and barrels of whiskey. Grand Rapids is opened up by the Erie Canal, 1825. People start really coming into the area because they can finally get here, right? And they do. We're back to our map, right? The surveyor comes through, puts it all in nice little lines, and sells the land, right? And this works out pretty well because you steal the land and then you sell it and you make a lot of money on it, right? This is what Grand Rapids looked like in 1831. This is a sketch. That's Noonday's village on this side of the river. On the other side of the river, you can see the mission and the blacksmith. That's right downtown. There used to be a couple islands right downtown. That village in the foreground is basically where Rosa Parks Circle is today. There's Isaac Mccoy, and he goes there partially as a missionary to Indian people and partially as an apologist for colonialism. He's a very complicated figure. He would say he's doing good for them. I think today we would call this West Michigan nice, because he's actually very much furthering the loss of their lands. And I'll show you how. He goes into it from the beginning, as he says, haunted with the painful reflection that the Indians would soon be driven from this place by the ingress of white people. He basically says, my job was to go in and try to civilize them as fast as I could before the white people pushed them out of here and to save their souls, right? And so that's what he tries to do. He says at the bottom there, the experience of 200 years has shown to everybody that the Indian cannot prosper on small tracts of country surrounded by other people. Now, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because what he means by that is when white people tend to get close to native people, they take their land. That doesn't mean they can't thrive near them, but it's always, the blame is always put on the native people, and this mythology develops that native people are actually racially bound for extinction, that something inherent to their racial biology means they can't survive in the modern world. And this is thought of as sad and not preventable. They are a noble savage, but they just can't exist in the modern world. So the best we can do is put them on reservations and try to keep them alive for a little while longer in sort of hospice care until they go extinct, right? Now, that's ridiculous, right? But that was everybody believed that at the time. Everybody believed that. Again, you get the quotes about they were not the owners of the land from Isaac Mccoy. But you also get, at the bottom there, an admission that we have been terrible to these people. This is why I say Isaac Mccoy is a bit of a complicated figure, right? So he's saying, we can't really stop this, we can't do anything about it, but also everybody knows this was awful, right? Now, everybody didn't agree with Isaac Mccoy, but he was at least open about that. What he wanted to do is set up an Indian territory, and this is ultimately what the United States did. They set up Indian country in Oklahoma, right? Isaac Mccoy, from little old Grand Rapids, Michigan, testifies in front of Congress about this, and is one of, I would say, the principal advocates of Indian removal, right? He says the only way to save these people, again, it's always done for them, right? The bad guys never say, we just hate Indian people, we're going to kill them. At this point in history, we've flipped to saying, oh, it's so sad, but we can't do anything, so the best thing is to do this because we love them, right? All right. So here he is at the very end of a 600-page book that I read, which I would not recommend doing, that he says is going to be a brief examination of the issues. Thanks, Isaac. He says, Christians, my fellow Christians, awaken from your lethargy and without delay come forward with prayer and faith and zeal to the glorious work of elevating the depressed aborigines to the privileges of citizens and the virtues of Christianity. Should the experiment of an Indian colony by opposing obstacles fail, will it not the prediction of the fearful and unbelieving be fulfilled in the extermination of the Indian race? But in its success, an achievement of Christian enterprise is anticipated, than which none is more noble, right? The field is whitening for the harvest. Hallelujah, the Lord God omnipotent reigns, right? So he's saying, we either put them in a colony or they go extinct, right? And as a Christian, we need to put them in the colony. Right, we take the land with whiskey and guns, and then we say, it's not good for you to be near us. We got to get you out of here, right? You can see the logic building. And then it happens with Andy Jackson, right? Andy Jackson had served with Lewis Cass, had met with Isaac Mccoy, had met with local Native people. He was just a bad person, but he was president when Michigan became a state, and we kind of did that by flattering him, right? So Jackson, the city of Jackson is named after Andrew Jackson. Cass County is named after Lewis Cass. All sorts of things around Michigan are named after members of Andrew Jackson's cabinet because we wanted him to make us a state. And he did. As one of his final acts in office, he made Michigan a state in 1837. But he also executed Indian removal. This is from his State of the Union address. Right? He says, the benevolent policy, again, this is for their own good, the benevolent policy of the government steadily pursued for 30 years in relation to the removal of the Indians beyond the white settlements is approaching to a happy consummation. Right? This is him talking to Congress. We're finally going to get them out of here. He is mostly concerned with the Cherokee, as you probably know, in Georgia, and he's concerned with the Cherokee because there is gold on Cherokee land that Andrew Jackson really wants. Again, cannibalism, profit, greed, mammon, right? And he says, maybe if we do this, they will finally cast off their savage habits and become an interesting, civilized, and Christian community. Now, he knew this was a lie too, just like Ben Franklin did, because this man was the president of the Cherokee Nation, John Ross. This is not a wandering savage. John Ross had fought with Andy Jackson in the War of 1812, right, for the United States. He knows who this is. He's met with him. He wears suits. He speaks English. He's a Christian. And yet Andrew Jackson is portraying him as this barbarian, right? And he says, rightly considered, our policy is not only liberal, but generous. We're doing it for your own good. And of course, this results in the Trail of Tears, right? And thousands of Cherokee are marched through the snow to their deaths on the way to Oklahoma at the behest of Andrew Jackson, carried out by his Secretary of War, none other than Lewis Cass, right? Who, after leaving Michigan, becomes Secretary of War for Andy Jackson. And then Grand Rapids, and I'm winding down. Grand Rapids, first guy here is this guy, who again, probably about as nice as he looks. His local nickname in Anishinaabe was Wagush, meaning the fox. And I don't think they call him the fox because he was a nice guy, right? Louis Campaw was French. He made his money on furs, right? Which is, again, an extractive, exploitative industry, right? Decimating beaver and other animal populations, selling the pelts as fast as he could get them. So he gets his money first that way, and then he spends that money buying all of downtown Grand Rapids for $90, $1.25 an acre. Pretty much the entire downtown Grand Rapids that you know today belongs to Louis Campaw with his fur trading money, and then he sells that to other people and gets fabulously wealthy. He also helps negotiate Indian treaties because he speaks the local language, and he gets paid a lot of money to do that, right? So this man gets rich off just exploitation of people and natural resources. Same thing with this guy, Lucius Lyon. They fight over it. Lucius Lyon wanted to call the city Kent. That's why it's Kent County. Compromise. Campaw wanted to call it Grand Rapids. That's also why downtown is so messed up, because Lucius Lyon owned the part on the left, and he wanted it nice and neat, and Louis Campaw liked it a little bit wilder. He preserved old Native American routes, which is why you get those diagonal streets you probably hate downtown. Lake Drive, right on our campus, is an old Native American route that goes pretty much directly from the rapids downtown to Reed's Lake. And that was a very common path that Louis Campaw just made into a street, right? Lucius Lyon wanted to bulldoze any remnants and put it all on a grid. So Grand Rapids becomes a city in 1838, right after we become a state, right? Same year, Potawatomi Trail of Death. We remove Potawatomi from Indiana. Lesser known than the Cherokee Trail of Tears, fewer people, but some local indigenous people were on this. It was mostly from Indiana, but again, the Potawatomi moved in and out of Indiana and Grand Rapids pretty seamlessly. They were the last to be forced out of the Lower Peninsula, the Potawatomi, on the Trail of Death to Kansas, which was what Isaac Mccoy had wanted, right? Grand Rapids becomes this frontier town. That's downtown, pretty near Rosa Parks. And how do we get wealthy? Again, extraction. Kenosha Creek, meaning the place of the pike, becomes Plaster Creek, where we get plaster for walls, right? They're mining for plaster here, which is the main ingredient today in drywall, right? We do that, and we cut down the entire state. We deforest the entire state in about 50 years. Takes us 50 years from 1838 when we become a state to in the 1880s, but we managed to cut down almost every tree in the Lower Peninsula. The only remaining pre-colonial trees in the entire Lower Peninsula are at Hartwick State Pines. It's about a square mile up north. You can Google it and go there and see what original white pines, our state tree, looked like before we cut them all down, right? This is from 1883, when in Grand Rapids there was a log jam during timber season on the river. They were using the river to transport timber. This log jam was, and this is just mind-numbing, 47 miles long. Trees cut down, right? So this is a wholesale deforestation. We often talk about Grand Rapids as the furniture city. You may have heard that Chicago burned down several times during this time period. All that was rebuilt with this timber, right? And that's how people got rich. When you walk around Heritage Hill and you see those old houses, you're looking at the legacy of settler colonialism in Grand Rapids. This money built those houses, the furniture factories, the timber. Most of the state ended up looking like this for several decades. And we did all this believing that we were, again, doing the right thing, making it fruitful, helping the land multiply. This is from a book written by a pastor in Ionia, another long book that I would not recommend reading unless you're doing presentations. But he says, look, history has no records of achievements so numerous as mighty as those accomplished by the white race. And then he goes on to say, you know, where once people with moccasined feet ran through, now the great civilizer, the railroad, is coming. We have tamed the rapids to the wheels of industry. The hills have been bared by the axe of the lumberman, right? Their valleys and plains are changed into farm and orchard, bearing crops unheard of by the Indian, who, although holding prior possession, must needs give way to the race who would make better use of the land than they, right? Now, again, I don't think this is better use. I don't think deforesting the state was better, right? Plaster Creek has ended up being, if you know the Plaster Creek watershed, one of the most polluted waterways in the state, right? In the heart of Grand Rapids. So I wouldn't say that was a good call. Isaac Mccoy's son, writing about this in 1916, right? So getting close. A man who, ironically, is named John Calvin Mccoy. He, again, repeating this, they were a doomed race. There was nothing we could do, right? He grew up as a child in Grand Rapids at the mission station. He knew Native people, but they're out of here. He also goes on to say some very racist things about African Americans, who he says have more of a political clout than Native people. So here he is saying we should care more about Native people, but right now, as he says, the woolly-headed, splayed-foot, thick-lipped African monopolizes our sympathies. He is a man and a brother qualified to make governors, legislators, rulers, and voters. The poor Indian is too poor to be worth cultivating, even for political purposes. This is an anti-Reconstruction screed, right? Where he's being incredibly racist and saying, you know, people only care about black people as voters for power, and we should never allow them to be in government, and we should care more about Native people. Finally, and then we're going to get to today, boarding schools. These have been in the news, with the news out of Canada that thousands of people graves have been found. But there's 3 of these in Michigan. I'll just talk about one. This is the one in Mount Pleasant, the Saginaw Band of Chippewa. This ran from 1893 to 1934, right? 300 students a year, right? Not a small school. There they are all marched in their little white uniforms while the colonial administrators stand on the lawn. They are just now starting to do some forensic work on this site because official records say that only 5 children ever died here. Oral records say that people died here all the time, right? So I would not be at all surprised if in the next couple of years we get pretty disturbing news out of Saginaw. Again, it was all this assimilation narrative, which I'm not going to talk about now. But finally, just because I had to take a shot at it, Gerald R. Ford, our only president, born a block away from my house, or not born, grew up on Union Street here, right? He was a member of a secret society at the University of Michigan called Michigauma. This is from 1966. He joined in the 30s. But Michigauma had actual Native American relics. Those weren't just costumes. Those were taken from grave sites and from people. And they had them in a room at the top of the Michigan Student Union, and they used them for ceremonies all the way up into the 70s. They gave each other Native American nicknames. This was a fraternity, right? So Gerald R. Ford was Flip 'em Back Buck. They had titles like squaw and this kind of stuff. It was incredibly racist and went on for a long time. They finally had to get rid of these relics in the year 2000 when Native American and black students at the University of Michigan discovered that this had been going on and was like, no, you probably shouldn't have that stuff. You should give it back to the tribes. They only changed their name in 2007. All right, so wrapping down, and we'll talk today. Key themes. Settler colonialism and missionary activity was part of a Christian narrative about race and place, identity and land. We were the people, white people, who were going to make the land productive. The native people never really owned it, and they were racially inferior and didn't deserve it, right? That's a clear narrative. This idea about greed, right? The exploitation of both the earth and the people. Today we talk about environmental justice, that you have to care for the people and the place together. Indigenous resistance, there's always been there, and it's still there today, right? I showed you the photo at the beginning of the woman holding the bowl. She's part of the Grand River Band of Ottawa water protectors, right? Who are working to try to restore the river, and not just so kayakers can use it, but so that it's a healthy ecosystem. And then finally, the idea of racist ideas justifying benevolent behavior and racist policy, right? All through our history, we have had this problem, largely because our history, again, parallels the development of racial science. We became a nation as we were developing bad science about race, and that infected the entire process. So today, how does this haunt us today, right? I'll give you a couple examples. One is this court decision, 2005, City of Sherrill versus Oneida. You don't need to know too much about this, but it was a dispute over who owned land and whether the Oneida Nation could buy back their former land and reincorporate it into their reservation, right? So they said, hey, this used to be part of our nation. If we buy it, can we make it part of our nation again? And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't. You can own it, but you can't make it part of your reservation again. And what did they cite? They cited, literal footnote, the doctrine of discovery, 2005, a Supreme Court case. That fee title to the lands occupied by Indians when the colonists arrived became vested in the sovereign, first the discovering European nation, and later the original states of the United States. That is Supreme Court case law right now, right? That decision was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So this is not also an entirely partisan thing, right? It was an 8-1 decision, the Supreme Court. Ironically, way back into the day, the Johnson v. McIntosh decision was for land that belonged to a future Supreme Court justice of the United States. All right, today, happy to report, Indigenous people have not disappeared. There are still Native people all around us. I first became interested in these issues because my wife worked for years as a nurse with the Nottawasepi Huron Band of the Potawatomi. So got to know many NHBP members, and through them, members of the Bokagan Band, Gun Lake Band, some of the other groups around town. So there are 12 federally recognized tribes in Michigan. There are over 500 in the United States. These are sovereign nations. Native Americans are political entities, not just racial groups, right? I actually asked people in enrollment in MSDO and some other offices whether we'd ever enrolled a student from any of these groups, and we don't know, but the answer is probably not, right? We've had some Navajo students because of our boarding school, but to the best of everyone's knowledge, we have never had a local Native American come to this school, even though it's built on this land, right? All right, one notable exception, and this is a cause that I'm gonna keep plugging away at for the rest of my time, is the actual local group to Grand Rapids is not federally recognized. The Grand River Band of Odawa, the descendants of Chief Noonday, do not have federal recognition. They've been working on it since 1994. The US government is delaying for reasons that are laughable. The last year they've been delaying because of COVID-19. They say, we can't look at your case because of COVID. Well, what about the last 26 years? Could you look at the case, right? This has bipartisan support. They've gotten letters from people like Bill Huizenga, Republican and Calvin alum, and Debbie Stabenow and Carl Levin. But the infrastructure at the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, is so bad that they have no idea when or if they're ever going to be given a free and clear hearing on this. This is something I'd like to see Calvin speak into too. Ron Yob is a friend of mine, tribal chair of the Grand River Band of Odawa, and he would like federal recognition. And no, the first question that everyone asks is it just about casino money? And it's not, right? I know Ron, I've known him for many years. He wants recognition because he deserves recognition. Okay, I'm gonna close out then. I think I timed this perfectly. With a song from the ceremony on August 29. Let's see, go to like 124, like 40. An hour 24:40, like way at the end. Yeah, right in there. All right, and then we have audio. Not many people came. I think the only other Calvin people I saw there were Ken and Gail Hefner. All right, so he's there. I'm just waiting on the finish here.
Okay, their water blessing is over, and now I'm going to have Nimke do. Whenever we end an event, we always have a traveling song that they sing for everybody's safe travels home.
This
so I'm going to have Nimke come up here and with his group and do a little traveling song. Nimke and Friends.
Way
Okay. So there's still, I looked at the last census data, about 4,600 Native people in Kent County. They're still here, still a vibrant part of our community. I'd suggest you connect with them. I took up all my time here, but I hope that was worth it. I would encourage you to work on these issues. I think our institution has a lot of work to do here, especially this year, 200 years after this land was taken. So thanks for coming out. If you need to duck out, please do so. I'll stick around after a couple minutes, and if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Thanks for coming.